as a financial economist, I began this investigation much like how I think economists and in many instances judges and lawyers view some of these challenges, is that it occurs because there's some kind of calculation going on. This falls out of the work of Gary Becker, who is a Nobel Prize-winning economist who really developed this school of thought around law and economics, where individuals are not abnormal, or there's not anything wrong with the individuals who engage in white-collar, any kind of crime, especially white-collar misconduct, but they're individuals that view the cost and benefit differently. So to the extent that the benefits exceed the costs, it actually makes sense to go ahead. And so in many ways, I thought, as I spent the time doing these conversations, I thought if I spent enough time with these individuals, I would see actually how they're doing this calculus. Maybe the benefits are high because of either the monetary gains or maybe the prestige, or maybe on the cost side, they just simply didn't think they would be caught. And that's how I initially proceeded. And after probably about a year or two of studying this area, I became, I'll say, pretty frustrated with that approach. That is, what I was witnessing is that many of the individuals who engage in misconduct did not seem to be coming to this conclusion after that careful weighting. Instead, what I saw them seemingly doing is what I call not a failure of reasoning, but what I would like to call a failure of intuition. That is that they didn't see the harm associated with their actions at the time. It just didn't feel harmful. And although that was, I think, a kind of a perplexing idea to try to reconcile, why can we see the harm obviously associated with this misconduct, but the individuals in some instances themselves can't see it at the time? Why could that occur? I think the interesting part, if one starts thinking about corporate misconduct, is that in most instances, the victims are quite distant. They're physically and psychologically far away. If we think of insider trading, in most instances, we say they're actually, we can't even identify a victim. It's the market that's harmed. So it's an amorphous entity. In other instances, there's actually a temporal offset. So at the time someone's actually engaging in misconduct, they're not getting an immediate sense that they're doing something wrong. In many instances, you actually see them being praised. So if we think of someone that's engaged in a Ponzi scheme, you see investors kind of jumping over one another, trying to give that person more money, more leadership positions. And it's only years later down the road when that misconduct unravels that harm becomes so obvious and impactful. So at the time one is actually engaged in the misconduct, one can actually seemingly almost not feel that harm that one is doing. And some instances actually feel that you're actually benefiting people like your firm and the employees within your firm. And so I think this is one of the really difficult challenges, because what I witnessed is a lot of, in many instances, very, very smart people making decisions that had these dramatic negative ramifications, but without that same distance that you would naturally feel if you were doing a street level crime. Naturally, I think this leads to the question of, well, what should we start to do with it? Because what I'm describing here is ultimately a challenge, but I think of human nature. What we like to believe is that if you put a rule into place that we know will stop ahead of going to that, across that rule or breaking that rule. But I think what we can find in our own kind of everyday behavior is that we all know that there are things we ought not do, and we ultimately do them. I think the easiest example I like to think of in my own life, and I think relates to many others, is speeding. I won't ask how many people in here drive and speed, but I'm guessing many would probably answer affirmatively to that question. And that is that we know you're not supposed to speed, but we nonetheless do it, and we find ways of rationalizing it. The speed limit's maybe just a little bit too low here. It's not really that consequential. It's okay to go 8 or 10 miles over the speed limit, even though there's a rule saying we shouldn't. At the same time, if we know something, if we feel something's harmful, so we actually intuitively feel in our gut that it's wrong, we don't even consider that a choice. So this is why in most people, if you have a disagreement with your neighbor, you don't really consider physically harming them. That's something reasonably socialized people just don't have enter their set, even if there was actually no law preventing it. So I often think that if where I live in the city of Boston was to drop prohibition against murder, I wouldn't be particularly worried about my neighbors coming over to harm me, simply because there was no law preventing them from doing so. But the challenge in most corporate contexts is we're not going to have that same feeling of wrongness. So I think really the challenge this leads to, and I'm sure we'll get more into as we get into discussion, is how can we actually create both the cultures, the norms, and what I think of as the compliance systems within firms to help nudge people to be the kinds of people they want to be, that both helps them have sustainable and successful careers, but also protects their firm.